I'd like to welcome you back to our Wednesday Bible study in the book of Proverbs. Today we will be in chapter 5, and we're going to try to go through the whole chapter today. Chapter 5 verses 1 through 23. And chapter 5 is a much needed lesson that our society needs to hear today. It talks about the dangers of adultery. Adultery has become something that is way out of hand today. It seems to be the normal with so many people, but we know that that nothing good comes out of it, and it's something that our society needs to take a hold of and put a stop to. So let's look here in chapter 5 and verse 1. Chapter 5 and verse 1 says, "My son, pay attention to my wisdom, lend your ear to my understanding." Now we are being reminded again of what we talked about last Wednesday in chapter 4 and verse 20, where it talks about many people have ears to hear, but not everyone is paying attention to what you're saying. So it tells us here in this verse, it says, lend your ear to my understanding. Solomon is wanting us again to pay close attention to what he has to say here, because these words of wisdom that he has for us is very important. So why? Why is it that we really need to get this? Well, look at verse 2. Verse 2 gives us the answer to that. It says, that you may preserve discretion and your lips may keep knowledge. It says that that you may preserve discretion. What that simply means is so that you can keep and so that you can appreciate good judgment. A lot of times bad judgment is what gets us in all these troubles that we get into sometimes. Bad judgment is what causes so many people to fall into the trap of adultery. So he is telling us to preserve our discretion, keep and appreciate good judgment. And then he says in verse 2, it says, and your lips may keep knowledge. Your lips, talking about the words that come out of your mouth. You need to use good judgment and be very careful of the words that you use while talking to the opposite sex. You need to be careful about the words that you use in conversations that you get into with the opposite sex. It's too many marriages have been broken up over the years because of a man or a woman spending too much time talking to the opposite sex, especially in the workplace. Because if you think about it, we spend more time in the workplace than we do at home with our spouse. So you need to be very careful with that. And verse 2 is telling us use good judgment and be careful about the conversations that we get into with the opposite sex. You don't want to just be talking about anything with the opposite sex. So be sure to use good judgment. Because look at verse 3. Verse 3 tells us, for the lips of an immoral woman drip honey, and her mouth is smoother than oil. It says, now it's talking about the immoral woman, but this can go for the immoral man as well. You know, this is a two-way street. We know it happens with both. Now, where it says in this verse, the lips of an immoral woman drip honey, the term drip honey, we may not fully understand that today. It may not have the effect on us like it did the day that Solomon wrote this. But I guess to help better explain this, if you would turn in your Bibles to the Songs of Solomon. The Songs of Solomon. And let's look over to chapter 4 and verse 11. Chapter 4 and verse 11 of the book of Songs, and see what kind of gives an idea of what Solomon's talking about here. He says in the book of Songs, chapter 4, verse 11, your lips, O my spouse, drip as the honeycomb, honey and milk are under your tongue. Now notice the word spouse he used there. He said, your lips, O my spouse, drip as honeycomb. You see, the lips of honeycomb, that is for true love only. The lips of honeycomb is a special bond between a husband and a wife. So the fact that this immoral woman has lips of honey makes it even worse because of the adultery, because the lips of honey are for husband and wife only. It's for true love. Now, another woman may have lips of honey, but they're not for you. Those lips are not yours. The only lips of honey that are yours is your spouse. So be very careful with that. You see, verse 3 tells us that her mouth is also smoother than oil. Now, this is not talking about the texture of her lips. Her mouth is smoother than oil. It's talking about she is a smooth talker. Listen, this is a warning to all the married folks out there. You better be careful and beware of smooth talkers, because listen, folks, seduction begins with flattery. Now, it happens that way every single time. Someone starts telling you how pretty you are, or oh, how lucky your spouse is to have you, and they start giving you all these compliments and all these things. Seduction begins with flattery. So these flattering words, they may sound good to you, but they're nothing but trash. All they are doing is talking trash to you. So no good's going to come out of that. Now look at verse 4. Verse 4 says, "But in the end, she is bitter as wormwood." In the end, she's bitter as wormwood. Now, wormwood is a symbol of suffering. Now, just to give you one example of wormwood, look over in the book of Revelations, chapter 8. Revelations chapter 8, verses 10 and 11. Revelations chapter 8, verses 10 and 11, it says, "Then the third angel sounded, and a great star fell from heaven, burning like a torch, and it fell on a third of the rivers and on the springs of water. The name of the star is Wormwood. A third of the waters became wormwood, and many men died from the water because it made them bitter." So you see, wormwood is a symbol of suffering, and nothing good comes out of it. So verse 4 says, but in the end, she is bitter as wormwood. In the end means at the end of all this, in the future, when all this is over, when you have fell into this trap of seduction and you fall into the trap of adultery, then the future of that, the ending of that, is going to be as bitter as wormwood. It's not going to turn out good. Now, look at the last part of verse 4. It says that a immoral woman, or this would go for a man as well, it says that they are sharp as a two-edged sword. They are sharp as a two-edged sword. Now, a knife is made for cutting things, but a sword, a two-edged sword, is made for stabbing, because it's got a sharp edge on both sides. Listen, when you get into a situation like this, in an affair and adultery and all these things that happen, there's a lot of stabbing that goes on. There's a lot of stabbing in the back. There's a lot of stabbing in the heart. So listen, if you don't want to get stabbed in the heart, then you don't want to get stabbed in the back, and if you don't want a lot of pain and a lot of hurt and a lot of cutting in your life, then you better stay faithful to your spouse. One thing that has always amazed me, and it's just beyond my comprehension, I just can't understand it, is when someone leaves their spouse and they say, and they leave their spouse for somebody else, and they said, oh, the Lord sent him to me. Or he may say, well, the Lord sent her to me. Listen, ladies, God is not going to send you somebody else's husband. He's not going to do that. Listen, men, God is not going to send you somebody else's wife. Now that's foolish thinking. Who thinks like that? Why do you think God would send you, ladies, why would you think God would send you somebody else's husband? That's crazy. Okay, let's look at verses 5 and 6. Verses 5 and 6 says, her feet go down to death. Her steps lay hold of hell. Lest you ponder her path of life, her ways are unstable. You do not know them. This verse right here is reminding us again that an immoral woman or an immoral man, they are traveling down a road that you do not want to go down. You don't want to take that path. And listen, it's always your decision. You can turn and go the other way. You can turn and go down that wrong road. If you go down that road, it's going to have a bad ending. It's going to be bitter as wormwood. Now look at verse 7. Verse 7 says, therefore, hear me now, my children, and do not depart from the words of my mouth. Well, we're being warned one more time to hear and understand these words. Now, why is it that? Why does Paul keep driving that point on to us that we need to understand this? Well, the reason why is because sexual sins have ruined so many people's lives. Sexual sins have hurt so many people and even children because of the divorce that takes place during this time. So that is why Solomon keeps reminding us of this. Okay, look at verse 8. Remove your way far from her, and do not go near the door of her house. Again, and I guess repetition is the best way to teach somebody something. Again, we are being reminded that the best way to deal with sin is to stop it before it ever starts. It says in this verse right here, remove your way far from her. Go in a different direction. And do not go near the door of her house. Listen, don't put yourself in a position to be tempted. Don't put yourself in that position that something may happen. If you feel like you are getting a little too comfortable with someone other than your spouse, you better stop it right now. If you feel like that you're getting a little too comfortable being around someone other than your husband or wife, you need to nip it in the bud. Put an end to it right now. That happens sometimes. You know, it starts off, like we talked about earlier, it starts off with conversations, with talking. And the next thing you know, you're in conversation that you shouldn't be in. Then the next thing you know, there's these smooth talking, the words of flattery are coming out there. And then the next thing you know, you're starting to feel a little too comfortable being around this person. Well, if you feel yourself being a little too comfortable being around someone other than your spouse, you better put an end to it now. Stop it right now. Nip it in the bud, as Barney Five says, because no good is going to come out of this. Now, I want you to pay close attention to what we're about to read in verses 9 and 10, because these two verses right here describe what's going to take place once you dive head first into one of these traps of adultery. Let's read verses 9 and 10. Lest you give your honor to others and your years to the cruel one, lest aliens be filled with your wealth, and your labors go to the house of a foreigner. Now, I want you to notice in these verses right here, the words like others and aliens and foreigners, and some translations have strangers. So what this means is someone else is going to be living in your home now. When you end up going down this road of adultery and then you end up divorced from your spouse, Next thing you know, a stranger is going to be sleeping in the bed that you used to sleep in. Somebody else is going to be living in your house. The house that you have worked for and been paying on, all that you have blood, sweat, and tears that you put into it, and all that you have is going to belong to somebody else now. The yard that you used to grill in, somebody else is grilling in that yard now. No telling how many times a spouse has rode by a house that used to be theirs, and now their spouse and someone else is living in it now, and somebody else is washing their car in your front yard. Somebody else is sitting at the table you used to eat in. Is it worth it? Is an affair, is it worth all of that? Is it worth losing all of these things? Look at verse 11. And you mourn at last when your flesh and your body are consumed. See, that's what it's going to feel like when you lose everything. Listen, it's got to hurt. It's got to hurt when you see somebody else in your house. It's got to hurt. See, that verse describes the pain and the hurt that a person goes through. Now, they don't see it at the beginning. They don't see all that. They don't think about all that. They're not thinking about the consequences of their sin. Sin has consequences. But they're not thinking about that. And then the next thing you know, they've lost it all. And next thing you know, they're just torn up about it. And next thing you know, then their heart is broken. Listen, that has got to hurt to lose everything, especially if you have kids. Okay, let's look at verses 12 and 13. And say, how I have hated instructions, and my heart despised correction. I have not obeyed the voice of my teacher, nor inclined my ear to those who instruct me. This is what you're going to say when it's all said and done. After you've got into this affair, you've had a divorce, somebody else is living in your house, you have the pain from losing it all, and then when that happens, this is exactly what you're going to say. Let me read it to you again. Verse 12 says, and say, how I have hated instructions, and my heart despised correction. I have not obeyed the voice of my teachers, nor inclined my ear to those who instructed me. You're going to be saying, why didn't I pay attention? Why didn't I listen? Why didn't I listen to everybody? Everybody tried to tell me I was doing wrong. Everybody tried to tell me that what I had was good. Everybody tried to tell me that the grass wasn't greener on the other side. Why didn't I listen? Why didn't I pay attention? Well, let's look at verse 14. Verse 14 tells us what this kind of life can do to your reputation. Look at verse 14. I was on the verge of total ruin in the midst of the assembly and congregation. A situation like this can bring you public disgrace in the community. And also notice in this verse the words assembly and the word congregation. What about your reputation in the church? If you are a Christian, what is this going to do to your testimony? Listen, is an affair really worth it? Is it worth destroying your life like this? Are you willing to risk everything for an affair? Okay, look at verse 15. Drink water from your own cistern and running water from your own well. Now, cistern and well is referring to your own wife. And notice the word own there. It says from your own cistern, from your own well, not somebody else's. So let your own wife, let your own husband be the only source of your pleasure, not somebody else's. Your own wife and your own husband should be your only source of pleasure, and attention should be from them. Okay, let's look at verses 16 and 17. Should your fountains be dispersed abroad, streams of water in the streets, let them be only your words and not for strangers with you. Now, what this is talking about is your spouse may start looking around out in the streets also for someone else if she finds out that you've been cheating on her. If your spouse finds out that you've been cheating on you, they may be going out in the streets looking themselves. So listen, when you go down this road of adultery, being unfaithful to your spouse, nothing good is going to come out of it at all. All right, look at verse 18. Let your fountain be blessed and rejoice with the wife of your youth. Now, he says the wife of your youth. In spite of Solomon and his many wives, I believe that this is a good example that God believes that the ideal situation is to have one wife. He says in this verse, the wife of your youth. That means your first wife. I married my first wife when I was 25 years old. And I'm still married to her today. So it's important to stay with the wife of your youth. Because when two people get married, it is God who puts you together. If you spent time praying and using good judgment and wisdom, and you married a person that God wanted you to, then that person was made for you. In other words, when my wife Tammy Jo was born, God had me in mind. He knew that with the day that Tammy Jo was born, he created her and said, I'm going to put her and Kenny together one day. So you see, when you seek out God to marry the right person, he is the one that joins you two together. So stick with the wife of your youth, this verse is telling us. All right, let's look at verse 19. As a loving deer and graceful doe, let her breast satisfy you at all times, and always be enraptured with her love. Now, this kind of pleasure should only, I repeat, only be found in the bonds of marriage. This kind of pleasure is for married people only. Listen, you don't go to someone else looking for this. This comes from your spouse and no one else. Okay, with everything that we have talked about today, in chapter 5, starting in verse 1, I want you to keep all these thoughts we've talked about in your mind as we finish out this chapter. I want to read it to you. It says, for why should you, my son, be enraptured by an immoral woman and be embraced in the arms of seductress? He said, why? Why would you want to do that? For the ways of man are before the eyes of the Lord, and he ponders all his path. His own iniquities entrap the wicked man, and he is caught in the cords of his sin. He shall die for lack of instructions, and the greatness of his folly he shall go astray. When you go down this path right here that Solomon is talking about, it's going to have a bad ending. So listen, folks, this deal with adultery is way out of hand. So pay attention to these words of wisdom that Solomon has given us. Use good judgment in what you say, in the conversations that you have with the opposite sex. Be careful of the words that you use. Be careful of the conversations that you get into. Be careful with when you get to feeling a little too comfortable around someone other than your spouse. You better put a stop to it right now. And watch out for the smooth talker. Watch out, because seduction begins with flattery. Remember that. All that is a trap. They're talking trash. So beware of all these things. And remember, if you keep traveling down that road, you can wind up losing everything. Somebody else is going to be living in your house. And not only that, you're going to ruin your reputation in the community. You're going to ruin it in the church. So use wise decisions, use good judgment, and all of your love, all of your attention should come from your spouse and nobody else's, only yours. Folks, this is something that we all need to pray about because we're all human. We all can make mistakes. So you need to be on top of your game with this and remember these words of wisdom, and it'll keep you in a happy marriage. Thank you for listening.